Welcome everyone to the first lecture of the Conspiracy and Democracy Project for this term. The Conspiracy and Democracy Project is a 5-year project funded by the Leverhulme Trust, and we have 3 principal investigators, Professor Sir Richard Evans, Professor John Norton, and Professor David Runciman. We look at conspiracy and conspiracy theories from various angles, and when that starts to get a little bit too sensationalist for us and we're embarrassed by that, we say that we also look at democracy. So it's the Conspiracy and Democracy Project. It's an interdisciplinary project. We just had our, we're halfway through it, and we marked in some ways our midway points by with a conference with the title Suspect Science. And if I'm not mistaken, originally Professor Simon Schaefer was to make a contribution to that conference, but there was obviously a clash of schedules. But Simon,
hidden powers.
Hidden powers, probably, exactly. I have to run with the whole conspiracy motive. But in any case, he's a man of his word, because he stepped up and he's agreed to deliver the first lecture for us in our Michaelmas term with the title Imitation Games, Conspiratorial Sciences and Intelligent Machines. Many of you, of course, know of Professor Simon Schaefer, and me still as a relative newcomer here to Cambridge. It seems in some ways a little bit silly that I should be introducing him to some people in the audience who obviously know him a little bit better than I do. But I have into the room, and my friend, she said to me, "Good, Simon's here. That means that if the lecturers have died, at least the discussion will be interesting." And you did not disappoint on that occasion. Let me just simply say, therefore, that I'm feeling kind of very optimistic about tonight, because Simon, of course, will be giving the lecture, and then I believe he'll probably be participating in the discussion. That's the way it normally works in any case. The way we'll proceed is simply as this. Simon will deliver the lecture, and then we have one of our postdoc research fellows from one of the other projects at Crash, the Technology and Democracy Project, Daniel Wilson. He will give a few comments, and then after that we'll open up the floor to discussion, and then after that a wine reception awaits us in the foyer. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Simon.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Sorry about the technical delay. As you'll see, I hope, that's actually rather the theme of the talk. This theme that I'm going to think about with you this evening comes out mainly of work that I've been doing for a very long time on the political history of robots and automata. And it seemed appropriate for the theme of suspect science, conspiracy and democracy in a host of ways. What I want to get at this evening is what we might call the furniture of some extremely well-known and extremely telling imagery and scientific programs that stretched through the early period of the Cold War, roughly from 1947-48 into the early 1960s. The theme in particular is precisely the politics of the figure of the robot, of the automaton, and the ambiguities of that figure. One ambiguity which I hope to have time to get to towards the end of the talk is that figure's Orientalism. My earlier work in the history of automata showed rather clearly the massive entanglement in Western imagination around the figure of the automaton, I'm thinking of the 18th and early 19th centuries now, between the automaton, mechanical intelligence, and so on, and orientalized subjects, Chinese, Japanese, Turks. Such aliens were understood by Euro-Americans as automata, that is to say, they were represented in this culture as mindless subjects of tyranny. Secondly, those cultures were extraordinarily good at building automata, because they possess, as it was said, fiendish cunning, and they hide what they have done, it was said, because they desire somehow to master us. So there is perhaps a very long-term political, aesthetic, technical relation between intelligent automata, Orientalism, and the covert, the secret, espionage, the spy, the passeur. The geography of this artificially engineered intelligence and life relies, I hope I'll have time to say, on the exoticism of distance and the esotericism of concealment. And if there's one text, one cultural object that shows this extremely well from the period that I'm going to talk about, it's of course this one, which you'll all recognize.
Allow me to introduce our American visitors. I must ask you to forgive their somewhat lackadaisical manners, but I have conditioned them, or brainwashed them, which I understand is the new American word, to believe that they are waiting out a storm in the lobby of a small hotel in New Jersey, where a meeting of the Ladies' Garden Club is in progress.
You will notice that I have told them they may smoke. I've allowed my people to have a little fun in the selection of bizarre tobacco substitutes. Are you enjoying your cigarette, Ed?
Yes, ma'am. Yak dung. Oh, tastes good, like a cigarette should. Now then, comrade.
May I present the famous Raymond Shaw?
Young man, you've flown 8,000 miles to this dreary spot in Manchuria to see. Raymond, pull your chair over here by me, please. I am sure you've all heard the old wives' tale that no hypnotized subject may be forced to do that which is repellent to his moral nature, whatever that may be. Nonsense, of course. Oh, you note-takers might set down a reminder to consult Brenman's paper, Experiments in the Hypnotic Production of Antisocial and Self-Injurious Behavior, or Wells' 1941 paper, which was titled, I believe, Experiments in the Hypnotic Production of Crime.
Or, of course, Andrew Salter's remarkable book, Conditioned Reflex Therapy, to name only 3. Or if it offends you that only the West is working to manufacture more crime and better criminals.
Against the modern shortages, I suggest Krasnogorsky's Primary Violence Motivation, or Surav's The Unilateral Suggestion to Self-Destruction.
My dear Jan, as you grow older, you grow more long-winded. And to get to the point, has the man ever killed anyone? Or has enough?
I apologize, my dear Dmitri. I keep forgetting that you're a young country and your attention span is limited.
So, The Manchurian Candidate, which as many of you will know, is based on a novel of 1959 by Richard Condon. The movie itself released in October 1962 at the same time as the Cuban Missile Crisis, and perhaps not coincidentally, Kesey's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, has become an obligatory passage point for any reflection on the relationship between conspiracy, brainwashing, passing, espionage, and the figure of the robot at the height of the Cold War. It was directed by John Frankenheimer, it was written by George Axelrod, and the theme was just that. They can make me do anything, can't they? According to Axelrod, the literature produced in the previous 15 years was studied religiously, the word is appropriate, not just by Axelrod and Frankenheimer, but by the protagonists in the movie, notably Sinatra, who plays perhaps the key role of Major Marco, one half of the Hamlet figure who dominates the movie. Making sense of the movie has become a huge literary, historical, aesthetic, and political industry. Susan Carruthers' work, now I'm sounding like the Soviet agent, right? Note takers in the audience, will want to consult Susan Carruthers' 2006 book on brainwashing, Catherine Grace Canino's 2008 paper, which relates the plot of the Manchurian Candidate, plausibly, sort of, to that of Hamlet, and David Seed's masterly work of 2006 on brainwashing, the Manchurian Candidate, and Fu Manchu. That's not my interest here. One can already see in the text in front of you that there are biographical and direct political linkages of a clearly, or at least that's how it was thought at the time, conspiratorial kind, linking the novel, the film, and the careers of the actors. This is a quotation from the FBI file on Sinatra when he presented for military service in December 1943. The patient stated he was neurotic, this is Sinatra, right? Afraid to be in crowds, afraid to go in the elevator, it makes him feel he'd want to run when surrounded by people. He had comatic, new word for me, ideas and headaches, and has been very nervous for 4 or 5 years. The examining psychiatrist concluded this selectee suffered from psychoneurosis and was not acceptable material from the psychiatric viewpoint. And indeed, as several of you will know, on that basis, Sinatra was excused military service. So the figure who perhaps more than any other stood for military work on screen was too psychologically unfit to do it in real life. The strange temporal order of the movie, I think, takes us a little closer to the theme I want to address. Joseph McCarthy, whose career provides one of the keys to unlock what the movie and the novel are about, had died back in 1957. The events of the novel and the movie are set in 1954. The patrol that Lawrence Harvey's character, Raymond Shaw, leads in the middle of the Korean War must have happened in 1952, and the war itself had, of course, begun in the summer of 1950 with the defeat of the American army on the Yalu River in October of that year, prompting the passage of the American Internal Security Act, passed over presidential veto during the summer, proposing compulsory registration, migration bans, emergency detentions, and this extraordinary and important sentiment that world communism has as its sole purpose the establishment of a totalitarian dictatorship in America to be brought about through treachery, infiltration, sabotage, and terrorism. So that's the crude political background. But there's also, this is rather my point, a background from the history of the human sciences, which I think we do well to reflect on. Because a great deal of what is at stake in the paranoid visions put forward in both versions of the Manchurian Candidate are already there in several places, some utterly predictable, some perhaps more surprising. In particular, they can be found in a significant group of projects, texts, memoranda, and manifestos produced by journalists and scientists during and in the immediate wake of World War II. They're there, for example, in the writings and activities of the great J.D. Desmond Burnell, professor at Birkbeck, one of the founders of the new science of molecular biology, winner of the Stalin Prize, head of the laboratory where Rosalind Franklin worked, colleague of Solly Zuckerman at the Ministry of Home Security, and author, amongst many other important works, of The Social Function of Science, first version of which appeared just before the outbreak of war in 1939, and a new version just at the end of the war in 1945-6. This was the great statement about the necessity to plan scientific inquiry against and over the heads of bureaucracy and capital, which would, of course, resist the rationalities of central planning. It went along, this is often missed, with Bernal's vision of a new kind of human nature. It was here, for example, that Bernal prophesied that within a very few generations, the leading intellectuals of a new socialist society, amongst which, of course, he counted himself, would be preserved as brains in vats. And it was against that image that C.S. Lewis, in his novel That Hideous Strength, attacks the idea of the disincorporation, as he puts it, of human nature. Similar themes are there in the extremely important writings of the great New York sociologist Robert Merton, who, well aware that, quote, incipient and actual attacks on the integrity of science have led scientists to recognize their dependence on particular types of social structure, led him to conclude that the Tower of Ivory, one of the very first uses of that phrase in the United States, has become untenable. Against that view, Merton offered up the four norms of science, four ethical principles of science: universalism, that truth must be evaluated by impersonal criteria; the significantly named communism, that truth must be collectively owned against ideas of secrecy, sequestration, disinterestedness, and organized skepticism. Those campaigns around Bernal's and Merton's rather contrasting visions of science policy were debated in the most lively and visible manner in the second half of the 1940s. Two people who responded to these views in significant ways were, on the one hand, a journalist, an American journalist and secret agent, essentially, Edward Hunter, born in 1902, who'd worked both for the press and in intelligence, and the brilliant Cambridge-trained mathematician, then working in Manchester, Alan Turing. Essentially, the prompt for my reflections this evening is that Hunter invented the word brainwashing in the autumn of 1950, the same week that Turing published his celebrated paper on intelligence and computation. And there's an extremely interesting synergy between Hunter's notion of brainwashing and what famously Turing proposes in that paper, which is the imitation game. Hunter first. Hunter had had a long career in journalism and intelligence. He'd worked as a printer. He worked for a range of American newspapers, including the New York Post. He'd been a Far Eastern correspondent. He began to collect Chinese material, most of which survives in a US online digitized archive and contains material like this. David Seed's book, Brainwashing, offers up a remarkable analysis, amongst other things, of what Hunter did and what he was up to with the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee and, of course, the House Committee on Un-American Activities. His word, brainwashing, he claimed in the article of 1950, came from the Chinese word xinao, which means, I'm told, to cleanse the mind, but had absolutely no connections with the use to which, the political use, to which Hunter would put it. And indeed, Hunter's writings were then distributed to South Korean troops in 1952, 53, and 54 to convince them of what the Chinese were up to. Hunter was closely linked with established psychological warfare, with the CIA, and, as you see here, his collection of Chinese pamphlets and images nourished his view that the Chinese had, first of all, recruited using brainwashing. Secondly, they were subjecting American and other prisoners of war to brainwashing. And thirdly, brainwashing would sap the roots of American democracy. So here we have an image from Hunter's collection on Chinese PRC mass education materials. This is the American way of life. That's the name of the pamphlet, printed in Shanghai in 1951. And the mirror phenomena that seems to me to be so characteristic of brainwashing paranoia is already evident here. In order to show that the Chinese have been brainwashing the Chinese and American prisoners of war, what Hunter shows is that the Chinese think capital is brainwashing the Americans. That's exactly what that image is designed to show. There were strong connections, as John Marks shows in his Search for the Manchurian Candidate of 1979, between what Hunter was up to, what he wanted folk to believe, what his allies held, and what was in fact going on in the inner circles of the CIA. What's striking about Hunter's work, however, is this phenomenon of projection, that he sees brainwashing as organically connected with the science of Red communism in general and Soviet and Chinese politics in particular. Hunter describes a joint session of the Soviet Academy of Sciences in 1950 in which Pavlov was honoured. He watches a Pavlov documentary on the nervous system. Guess who he takes to see the film? Ayn Rand. He says the Red script writers made Pavlov a sort of master magician with occult powers over men's minds, the Merlin of dialectical materialism. Now, as I say, there were strong resonances, very strong, between this kind of vision of what was at stake in clearing out the mind, precisely as we'll see later, turning subjects into automata, into robots, and discussions inside the CIA. For example, the US Army's operations Little Switch and Big Switch, run significantly perhaps at Valley Forge in 1953 to de-wash, that was the word that was used, prisoner of war returnees from their hallucinated and no doubt brainwashed state. Those programs were then written up in a pseudo-official report by Eugene Kincaid in 1959, Every War But One, and that was one of Frankenheimer's main sources for his version of the Manchurian Candidate. Similarly, as is extremely well known, a whole series of projects of hypnosis, brainwashing, sensory deprivation, and the production of automatic or robotic behavior was launched in Washington and from the CIA between 1953 and 1955. It's said, for example, that the author of this security memo, Morse Allen, hypnotized two secretaries, one so that she would fall asleep, and the other so that she would kill the first secretary if she did not awake, and Allen proposed, but did not implement, a plan to hypnotize a communist defector into assassination, followed by arrest and inevitable execution. So there was a range of views about brainwashing and its automatisms in play in the middle of the 50s. For Hunter himself, brainwashing was omnipotent. There were no ways of resisting it. All that could be done was to invent and then institutionalize counter-brainwashing forms of behavior, as was in fact going on in the CIA. There were those like Kincaid, who'd reported on the Little Switch and Big Switch experiments at Valley Forge, for whom brainwashing worked so well because of the moral and psychological weakness and corruption of contemporary American manhood. So that there was something about the contemporary situation in the early 1950s in the United States which made those military subjects, those conscripts, peculiarly vulnerable to what was going on in the laboratories of the Soviet and Chinese systems. And finally, there were clearly those, like the psychologists Harold Wolff and Lawrence Hinkle, based mainly at Cornell, for whom brainwashing might indeed produce robots, but it was not an effective way of producing robots that would convince others that they weren't. Part 2. With those themes in view and their immense public visibility, this was discussed monthly in newspapers, broadcasts on the radio, and so on, it becomes extremely interesting to re-examine some of the better-known robot movies of the time. Here are two of my favourites, but they're also deeply representative. Forbidden Planet, with the magnificent Robbie the Robot, performing the role of Ariel on a kind of high-tech Prospero's Island, and much more interesting, just a few weeks before the release of The Manchurian Candidate, a film called Creation of the Humanoids. Creation of the Humanoids involves a scientist, Dr. Raven, who's invented a technique to turn robots into something that looks human, using a thalamic transplant, for those of you who want to try this at home. The threat of replacement of humans by these humanoid hybrids becomes apparent. And one of them is captured and analysed by a gang who resemble, all too obviously, the Ku Klux Klan. And here they are.
I only know that when wired into the central circuits, the robot claimed to be an able-bodied spaceman second class named Kelly. Tests show he was telling the truth. When brought in, he was incoherent. I'm afraid I damaged him in removing the unit.
Evidently, they found a way to transplant memory.
We checked him through the Bureau of Identification. There is or was a spaceman named Kelly. This robot's fingerprints and retinal patterns checked with those on file for the man.
Well, if they duplicated this Kelly, do you suppose they killed him?
No. I think I can speak positive on that point. The robot denied it when wired for absolute truth. They found him dead.
Well, if the man was dead, how would he have a memory?
Memory consists of facts. Facts can't be destroyed. They can only cease to be used.
You say he was incoherent when he was brought in?
Yes.
Facts can't be destroyed. They can only be cease to be used. So there's a massive culture right through from the late 40s to the early 60s on which the movie and other artworks, if it is an artwork, trade, which links together robots, cognitive machinery, forms of brainwashing, and a kind of oriental threat. It's very clear in both the novel and the film that this is the sort of automatism to which the Lawrence Harvey and the Frank Sinatra characters are being subjected. And it's very clear indeed in the way in which Hunter himself, in his brainwashing in Red China, the first revelation of the terrifying methods that have put an entire nation under hypnotic control, in explaining the mystery behind the voluntary confessions of the innocent, puts the point. The object is to bring about that robot creature endowed only with instincts. The intent is to change a mind radically so that its owner becomes a living puppet, a human robot, without the atrocity being visible from the outside. The aim is to create a mechanism in flesh and blood with new beliefs and thought processes inserted into a captive body. This atrocious quack science, devised by the Reds, is to bring about the voluntary submission of people to robot-like enslavement. Now, it seems to me that it's absolutely evident that there is, amongst all the other themes in this extraordinary set of passages, a deep Orientalism. And here, I'm not sure I have time, I would want to evoke the crucial history that links those two themes together, Orientalism and automatism. Artists, engineers, designers, and iconographers were absolutely fascinated by what they took to be the ubiquity of clever and ingenious machines in the East in general, and in China and in Japan in particular. Tea sets like this from the late 18th century. It was for this reason, precisely, in ways which I think precede but also bizarrely mimic the wonderful world of Edward Hunter. It was for this reason that those manufacturers in Britain in the late 18th and early 19th century, as many of you will know, were obsessed with selling and exporting to China and perhaps even to Japan automata like this, cast into Orientalist form. These magnificent specimens, which constitute almost all the labour of a long life, were all executed and originally intended as presents for the East. They have all the gorgeous splendour so admired. There we can fancy the absorbing admiration they would create in the harems of Eastern monarchs. The geography of Thomas Weeks is going a bit wonky here, where their indolent hours must be agreeably relieved by these splendid baubles, which are, however, so constructed as to combine in almost every instance some object of utility. So a kind of mirror game had long characterized, it seems to me, the relationship between Orientalism, automatism, and tyranny, in which the West projected onto China and Japan a culture of automatism, a culture of tyranny, a culture of corruption, and a culture of enslavement, which they would then nourish with their own ingenious devices. And that is exactly what was going on in the 1940s and 50s. There were other ways in which that's expressed, notably, as Chris Frayling and others have pointed out, through the immense cult of Sax Rohmer's hero, villain, Fu Manchu, who in almost every novel and certainly every movie has an all-powerful robot. This is a robot of Genghis Khan that Fu Manchu constructs in 1936 with a magic sword which will raise the forces of the East and overthrow the whole of Western civilization. So having evoked that idea of Orientalism, we can then, I think, return to what Hunter and his allies in the agency were about. Like that story, there was a mirror projection. There was a way in which, I'm suggesting, they were seeing in Chinese propaganda, Chinese tyranny, and Chinese brainwashing a will simultaneously to enslave their own population and, crucially for my argument, to produce a kind of robot-like enslavement there, which was married to an attempt to produce humans who could pass as agents back here. The crux of Hunter's argument, significantly for my story, is this passage. My journey to the East has coincided with fascinating stories in the press in America about the construction by our mathematicians and mechanics of a mechanical brain that by use of electronics could compute in a moment what Einstein in his prime, with all his genius, might have needed many years to compute. Man has learnt not only some of the theoretical processes that go on in a man's head, but also how to direct his thoughts. The whole field, Hunter continues, of psychology has broadened to embrace everything that influences thought and attitude, from the first crude publicity put out for a movie actress to psychological warfare. In effect, our entire field of modern communications media, from public opinion surveys to aptitude testing, and it is used by individuals in private and public life, by small firms and big corporations, and by political parties and governments. The resonance with Vance Packard's Hidden Persuaders of 1957 is very, very clear there. So the political geography of this paranoid argument is extremely intriguing, if not baffling. On the one hand, Hunter and his allies are unambiguously associating brainwashing and similar initiatives with the Orient, with the socialist, tyrannic, enslaving Orient. And they bring out all sorts of ways in which the robots produced there become indistinguishable here from ordinary, everyday folk. While at the same time, both in Hunter and, of course, in Packard and cognate arguments, there is an insistence that the cultural institutions of the West, public opinion surveys, aptitude testing, corporations, firms, political parties and governments, are doing something rather similar. And how do we know that? We principally know that because of work on artificial intelligence, the production of a mechanical brain. This takes us straight to the roots of Turing's program. Turing had spent substantial periods of time just after the Second World War moving between the National Physical Laboratory and Manchester, with Princeton, New York, and Cambridge, Massachusetts. And his immediate interlocutors, men like the great neuroscientist J.Z. Young, pictured here, were extremely familiar with the cybernetic program of that period, the Macy conferences of 1947 to 1953, where with John von Neumann, Ross Ashby, Warren McCulloch, Gregory Bateson, Margaret Mead, and a substantial amount of CIA support from the MK Ultra project, the themes of brainwashing and of passing were much discussed. So when, in 1949 to 50, Turing, then working in Manchester, and also simultaneously at the National Physical Laboratory on the new automatic computing engine, ACE, began to discuss these issues with Young and others, his principal concern rapidly became the problem of discriminating between a human and an intelligent machine. Turing was very clear how that discrimination would be undermined and rejected by the powers that be. Quote, "They will surround the whole of their work with mystery and make excuses couched in well-chosen gibberish." To counter that kind of idealized mystification, Turing distinguished between rules of conduct governing every eventuality, which were of course not to be had, and laws of behavior, which might exist, though currently being unknown. The distinction between conduct and behavior explained for Turing how robots and machines could learn. Brainwashing, then, would be a way of making people, intelligent people, precisely because one knows with certainty only what one builds. Young mattered to this argument because in 1950 he'd given a major series of radio lectures on new models of the brain, lectures whose transcripts Hunter had certainly read, using the then fashionable language of cybernetics. He compared the brain with a guided missile system and with a mechanical computer based on networked valves. Quote, love this quote from Young, "In order to have some picture of how the brain works," we're a year after Orwell's 1984, "in order to have some picture of how the brain works, it's useful to think of it as an enormous ministry whose one aim and object is to preserve intact the country for which it is responsible. The ontology of the enemy," as Peter Gallison has called it. Young's version of brain science therefore closely tracked Anglo-American changes in communications technology and brainwashing psychology. Managerialism and robotics were the right way to run society and model the brain. We don't know much yet about what goes on in our brains. We can't expect educators to educate them properly, psychologists to help us correct their workings, or surgeons to know whether it's wise to cut pieces out of them. Unquote. As he prepared to write up these broadcasts for publication, Young needed advice on estimating the storage capacity of a brain-like machine. And he recalled meeting at Manchester a year earlier in a discussion on the mind and the computing machine. There, Young had debated with cyberneticists and with Alan Turing and, who's in top left, and the physical chemist, ferocious anti-communist, enemy of Bernal, social theorist and founder of the sociology of scientific knowledge, Michael Polanyi. Young, Turing and their contemporaries were much impressed by the idea of the intelligent machine and its link with the robot. Young urged that such systems were the best possible models of how brains work. Polanyi, by contrast, worked hard to show how this kind of eliminativist neurology, cybernetics, brainwashing, and the vices of communism all fitted together. He argued that these scientists, Turing, Bernal, and Young, reduced their subject matter to measurable variables and were going to get rid of discretion and will. Their program would turn people into robots, and communism did the same, and it had seduced fellow travelling intellectuals like Bernal because rational action, quoting from Polanyi, rational action becomes a lifeless banality. And it was in those circumstances, between the summer of 49 and the autumn of 50, as you know, I guess, that Turing composed his great paper and sent it to the nation's preeminent philosophy journal, Mind, under the title Computing, Machinery and Intelligence. Now, what's crucial about that paper for me is two things. First, how the imitation game is forged. The imitation game, as you'll know, I guess, is not initially presented as a game to be played by a machine. The imitation game begins like this. Imagine that you have a judge or an inquisitor who sits in a separate room from a man and from a woman, and that the man and the woman can only communicate with the judge in writing. The task of the inquisitor judge is to determine which is the woman. The woman tries to convince the inquisitor that she's the woman. The man tries to convince the inquisitor that he is the woman. The man tries to convince the inquisitor that he is female. Then, Turing says, remove the man and replace the man by a machine. So the task of the machine in the imitation game is not to convince the judge that it is a human. The task of the machine is to convince the judge that it is female. And the other competitor in the imitation game is female. There are now, as you probably know, Turing test imitation game competitions run by Hugh Loebner, the multi-millionaire manufacturer of well-sprung disco dance floors. If you win, you can win either by making a machine that is convincingly human or by being a human and convincing the judge that you are a human. So some people in Lerner's game get medals for being extraordinarily human, and some people get medals for having designed machines that are extraordinarily human. That's a bastardized but fascinating version of Turing's original formulation. Turing's original formulation is explicitly about parsing. It's about espionage. It's exactly the situation that the Manchurian Candidate envisages, in which the game is to pass as some other, not to represent as a normal type, but precisely to pass as something one is almost by definition not. The second crucial thing about the imitation game is the way in which issues of brainwashing and robotics play their role in it. Turing was absolutely clear that there was no point at all trying to design an intelligent machine that looked human. He says we don't expect our machines to do very well in beauty contests, just like we don't expect humans to win a race against an aeroplane. He says doing that is like insisting that every motor car should have legs rather than wheels. No, for Turing, the robotic is about the brainwashed, is about being programmed. Anything that could be turned into a routine could be aped by a universal machine, and so plausibly performed by the kind of brains that Young and Turing and the brainwashers were all thinking about. Young, for example, deprecated intellectual talk of pseudo-things and semi-things like consciousness or mind. He claimed that cerebral evolution explained why humans might now resist the possibility of treating brains as machines, so replacing one by the other and then finding it hard to tell the difference. Turing spent a lot of time in those years detailing the social organization required and the gibberish with which the bosses would resist automation. This is what led him, as he put it, to the question, how far is it possible in principle for a machine-like computer to simulate human activity? So, what I've tried to evoke for you here is a series of themes in automatism and brainwashing and computer intelligence, which I think were fundamentally entangled and linked at the moment of the high Cold War. The Manchurian Candidate, like the Turing test, is all about concealment, detection, and revelation. Its appeal hinges on a place where intelligence is to be found specifically and only in a zone to which access is otherwise forbidden. In a celebrated paper published in 1980, the philosopher John Searle argued famously against the conventional interpretation of the Turing test. Searle proposed, it seems to me very significantly, what he called a Chinese room occupied by a human being completely devoid of intelligence about Chinese, but supplied with a set of rules which would allow response to inquiries from outside the room. Searle urged that such a system would pass the Turing test by being indistinguishable from native Chinese speakers to anyone outside the room. You see the idea. But neither necessary nor sufficient conditions could be given for attributing intelligence to such a system. In response to the suggestion that while the room's occupant might not possess intelligence about Chinese, yet the entire system might be said to do so, Searle countered that the enterprise of machine intelligence, of artificial intelligence, I quote from him, must be able to distinguish the principles on which the mind works from those on which non-mental systems work, unquote. So according to him, to judge that a system is intelligent just because of its inputs and outputs would force us to attribute intelligence to a wide range of non-mental systems, not just machines, but brainwashed returning POWs. The parable of the Chinese room, the long history of brainwashed Oriental automata, I've argued, dramatize the spatial mode of our thinking about intelligence and conspiracy by insisting on a definition of those special places where intelligence, in all the senses that the Cold War familiarized us with, might be said to reside. Thank you. Your first.
Thank you very much, Simon. So I think one of the things you showed us so nicely there was the ways in which science and technology have been both tools for those wanting to conspire in different ways, but also as the subject for conspiracy theorists, in part due to the esotericism and the secrecy of their processes, among other things. And it's interesting you mentioned Merton's requirement for communism, which really an interesting coincidence. But that reminded me of a much earlier scientist, John Wilkins, for example, one of the founders of the Royal Society in the 17th century, who faced some of these questions about the extent to which things in science should remain secret or remain open. And even then it was completely a contested question as to which things were revealed and disclosed and which things would not. And that applied as much to questions of statecraft as it did to those of scientific work itself. So that question of what remains secret and what is opened up is a much longer question. Interestingly, John Wilkins himself was the founder of secret languages and ciphers at the same time as being an advocate for openness as well. So that's maybe one general area we might wish to just explore a little more. For those interested in conspiracy and democracy in particular, the question is normally framed in terms of who is conspiring and against whom, and who thinks they're being conspired against and why. So with that in mind, we might think a little bit more about what special properties science has in this regard. Again, your juxtaposition of Turing's paper with Hunter's invention of the term brainwashing is something I'd like to hear a little bit more about what you think. Is it merely a coincidence it happens in that week? I mean, you've given us a little flavour of some of the things at play there, but I'd like to hear a little bit more on what you think the significance of that really is. I was also interested to see that image of the Chinese view of the American propagandists or brainwashers at work, since that illustrates beautifully the symmetrical nature of this fear. And I suppose you touched on the fact that in the 1950s, even in the US, there was a sense during the middle of this brainwashing fascination that it wasn't just brainwashing by spies and secret agents that was at play, but also US culture, its capitalist forms of advertising, psychiatric treatments, and so on, were themselves a source of brainwashing, just in the atmosphere more generally. So in that climate of fear and suspicion, it was interesting to see more specifically this fear of replacement by machines, both literally, which has its own history, of course. We could talk about the Mechanical Turk as the kind of example of that, both its 19th century forms and as that realised by Amazon, but also replacement by machines in the mental sense, so having our minds replaced in some way. And I suppose in that sense we might ask what happens to a population whose minds have literally been replaced in some way, and what is the result for democracy? Again, central issue running through all of these questions. Just finally, I would highlight your interest in Orientalism. Yes, I was very glad to see that you drew that genealogy before the Cold War, because clearly it's a much longer standing story. But we might also think of its continuation until today. I just thought while you were talking there of George Osborne's most recent mega deal with the Chinese, which has been criticised for lots of reasons, but chief among them was the idea that when the Chinese build all our nuclear power stations, they're going to fit them all with bugs in order that they can work out what we're thinking. So just on that note, I suppose I'll just finish, really, and allow you to...
Thanks, that's great. Do you want me to
Or we can
answer?
If you'd like to respond,
Yeah.
please.
Okay, in order. Yes. One of the things that's very striking about what we might call the history of the philosophy of science, going back to Wilkins, but massively there in Polanyi and Merton and Bernal and other gurus of the mid-20th century as well, is that it's very clear that it's very often precisely at the moment of the most intense mobilization of reliable technical knowledge, as it's understood, that an insistence simultaneously develops on the values of free communication, of collectivism, of the need for publicity, and of the deleterious effects of control on information flow. Right? You see that in the early Royal Society very well. Wilkins and Wallace are great examples. You absolutely see that in the late 18th century around the Academy of Sciences and the Institute. And you certainly see that in the period that I was talking about. One of my favorite examples, no relation, is a great American physicist of the period, Edward Condon, no relation of Richard. Richard wrote The Manchurian Candidate. Edward was a nuclear physicist who only lasted 6 weeks on the Manhattan Project because he couldn't stand the secrecy regime at Los Alamos and resigned in fury and was pursued by Edgar Hoover and the House Committee for more or less the rest of his career. He wrote a really, really important and very rich memorandum for UNESCO at the end of 1948, which is available online, in fact, so I discover, about exactly this question, about the relationship between, as he put it, the freedom of science and the 3 senses of security. 1, security as feeling calm. 2, military security, being well armed. And 3, classification. Classification and declassification were new words in those senses in 1948 and 1949. Turing himself massively protested about the use of the word unclassified to mean not dangerous, not secret. There's a wonderful letter in King's, in the Turing papers, from Turing to his mother, explaining to his mother that this package that has arrived at the family home from the Ministry of Supply with large red letters on it that says unclassified does not mean chaos or we don't know where to put it. It means there's nothing secret in this envelope. That was a new word in Turing's period, and it absolutely plays into a lot of his work. There are 2 other things. The specifics of the Hunter-Turing relation are an entire coincidence, and I just thought a nice hook for the evening. I'm not going to make anything more than the particular coincidence. But there is a structural relationship between those 2 projects, since they're both directly connected to the cybernetics group and to the debates that both men attended, as far as I can tell, separately between 1946 and 1949 in the US and Britain, in which models of brain and models of mind understood in terms of an intelligent machine pretending to be something that it is not were absolutely central to the model of philosophy of mind and politics that both men were trying to debate. Politically and in every other way, they are poles apart, as Bernal and Merton are, but the shared discourse in which that work is launched seems to me to be very striking and rather, perhaps, easy to miss. Lastly, yes, Orientalism is, tragically, of course, still an absolutely critical politico-conspiratorial theme, or so I believe, and the way in which it involves this extraordinary kind of symmetrical projection seems absolutely fascinating to me. To spell out that point in a little more, what's at stake, after all, is the idea that automatism produces simultaneously people whom it's effortlessly easy to see are programmed, and people whom it's impossible to see are programmed. Both of those thoughts are in play in the world of Hunter and Turing. That it's obvious when, for Hunter, for example, the Chinese are programmed. That's the only explanation of the triumph of the People's Republic, right? And yet at the same time, his books are full to overflowing of the insistence that programmed people easily pass. And both of those thoughts are there in both writers, right? And I think that's a very interesting Orientalist aspect in the sense that I've tried to define it here. But thanks really much.
Good. Then I think the predicament that we're actually looking at is that we got off to a somewhat late start. Some people are taking the opportunity right now to make a run for it. But we normally start the drinks at 7:30. Is that correct?
I think it's scheduled
For when?
7.
For 7? Then that means, then let me correct myself then, because actually then, correct, we do have some time for some questions. It's just that simply when there's alcohol outside, I begin to act in a fairly robotic, automated way.
Oh, that's the key.
But I can be patient.
Because we started it an hour ago.
Exactly. Well, then that I would say let's open the floor up. So if there's some discussions, if we have about a quarter of an hour for discussions, then we can move outside for drinks. So, Richard?
Just to add to your last point, Simon, was absolutely reminiscent of the German Nazi anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, the world conspiracy to destroy the Aryan race and so on, which simultaneously said that Jews were easily distinguishable by their features, by their physical features, and you can see this in a million pieces of Nazi visual propaganda. And on the other hand, insisted that they had to wear a yellow star because that's only that way could you see who they were.
Right. No, I think it is absolutely crucial right through that period, and clearly there are important links, which I'm too ignorant to be able fully to pursue here, between anti-Semitism and its other, and the transposition of those discourses onto the situation in the late 40s through the mid-50s, which are often either explicitly or implicitly anti-Semitic, but absolutely they are, or, as you pointed out, the structure of argument just stays the same and it's simply transposed. One sees that very clearly in a lot of Hunter's writings and a lot of writings coming from the agency in 52, 53 and 54.
Okay, I'm struck here by some parallels with Philip Mirovsky's history of neoliberals. So people like Hayek, Friedman, and their views of how humans aren't rational agents, whether because of psychological failings or because the state gets in the way, bureaucracy gets in the way, but we must be sort of transformed in some ways. And there seems to be parallels here. We're describing Western man as enfeebled. We're talking about the same period.
Absolutely the same period, and in some cases the same people.
Reference.
Yeah, I mean, there's a very strong connection between Hayek and Polanyi through the LSE and through the, Society for Freedom in Science, which Polanyi co-founded with Baker as a pretty ferocious Cold War anti-communist, anti-Soviet, anti-planning model of the state's proper relationship with the market on the one hand and the sciences on the other. The reason it matters to my sub-discipline is because Polanyi, as I said, is one of the founding texts of anything like an adequate sociology of scientific knowledge, more or less for the reason you've just given, which is that it's in Polanyi that one finds, as in Hayek, the notion that reliable knowledge is essentially craft, it's artisanal, it's embodied, it's non-rational, it can't be programmed, It's not like an algorithm. It's not subject to the principles of abstract logic. It cannot fully be spelt out in explicit ways. And so the way in which the sciences, Polanyi and Hayek, both in different ways, argue, are pursued, is through something that can't be expressed in formal language. And that was taken by Polanyi especially, who sees it slightly less in the anti-serfdom book in Hayek, as the great epistemic bulwark against Soviet central planning and its fellow travelling allies, since the idea were to render everything transparent, to bring from the incorporated what must be spelt out, absolutely illuminated. One can't do that with science and technology, they say. Right? So my final remarks about embodiment and seclusion are explicitly designed to capture that theme. But that theme does not belong to the radical left image of the sciences in this period. It belongs to the most conservative image of the sciences and of economic life in that period. And that's a very interesting chiasmus, politically and critically. Right? Is it more progressive to insist on the embodied and the artisanal, or more progressive to insist on the transparent, the planned, and the algorithmic? That's part of what Turing's paper is all about. Absolutely that, right? His reference to gibberish is a more or less explicit reference to Polanyi and the head of the then head of the NPL, George Darwin, who absolutely believed in embodiment and eugenic grace, I suppose we should call it.
Simon, do you?
Certainly could. Yes. I want to ask a question about the precise historicisation of the moment.
Yeah.
In the sense that, reflecting back on what Richard said, if we were looking for that structure of paranoia, you could certainly find it a lot earlier, say in sexual anxieties. You can always tell someone who's a sexual degenerate, no, you can't. You know, that sort of game of can you, can't you? Yeah. Certainly in the 1890s, 1880s, you get that absolutely through normative literature. And then the Orientalism that you look to, I wondered what had happened to the Nazi modelling. The idea that the real automata are the marching, jackbooted Nazis. Aren't they always there behind that picture in the 50s? So, and if we went forward, one would presumably end up in Star Wars. And that sort of moment of everybody being but trust the force because you're a bourgeois American. You can sort of, you can get outside automation and you'll be all right in some way, as long as you don't hear the voice in your head as something weird, then you'll be all right. And I never understood the film. But but in a sense, so what I'm worrying about is the moment to which, is what you're suggesting that there's a real moment here, or is it more of a bricolage of things from the past and things, as it were, we could still carry on seeing, that just happen to come together in that way?
So I don't think it just happened to come together. I think there is a point in conjunctural analysis for, say, 1948 to 1956. Because clearly all of those features are massively available in well worked up, well developed cultural forms, but two or three quite specific crises and issues seem to bring it together. Most intellectual historians of the period who've looked at this kind of work, Jamie Cohen-Cole's excellent book, for example, on the post-war origins of American human science, would put cybernetics very close to the centre of this. So the work of von Neumann, of Norbert Wiener, and so on is absolutely crucial as a way precisely of bringing together a lot of these resources, no doubt in perhaps a slightly unreflective way, but no doubt they're already available. But the specificities are very striking. Two other things particularly seem to be important. One is in strong contrast to either the discourse on the moral and neurological collapse, let's say, of the British officer class in the First World War, and Rivers' work there, right? Or a fortiori, the work on returning POWs in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. The Korean moment is very, very specific, so that what's at stake in Condon's novel reflects a genuine, real, massive, specific concern that American GIs seem in Korea to have been peculiarly susceptible to brainwashing and being turned into agents when they return. Right? There's a movie which I really do not recommend that anybody here watches, made in 1954 by Ronald Reagan, which already has Reagan as the only officer in the group who resists communist brainwashing when they return. So it's a kind of anti-Manchurian campaign. Right? Not even going to talk about what happens later in Reagan's career. So the war and that experience, I think, gives it a very special meaning. You see that not only in the States, but of course in Britain at this period, when espionage and the role, finally, of technoscience in that espionage plays an almost unprecedented salient role. This is the period of Fuchs, Burgess, McLean, and the idea that there are goes back to this question, that there are particular technical secrets which, because science is like an algorithm, can be passed around and learned. Right? One of the wonderful things about Edward Condon's paper of 1948 is that he simply denies that science is like it. He has a long passage where he spells out the fact that knowing how to build the bomb is not an epistemic unit that you could write down and pass around. So it seems to me there are some very specific things linking the military, linking industry, and linking science, which of course can be found massively precedented, and which carry on today in George Lucas's wildest imaginings. But they have a very specific valence at that moment in the history of science, and especially in the history of the human sciences, I think. In other words, what is going to be the scientific model of intelligence embodied or machine-like or both.
And would you relate that to Ray Daston's work on risk?
I think it's absolutely like that, right? Because I think notions of calculation, probability, and hazard, particularly, play an absolutely critical role in that. All these fictions, all these artworks, are essentially reflections on that particular story, and that's absolutely right.
It seems like these ideas are kind of diffused step for step, both literally and imaginatively, in the transformation of the economy at the time. So, looking at the picture of him taking the knowledge out of the worker's cap, you can think of the Taylorist revolution, and then we get cybernetic transformations of management, secretarial labor. That's also obviously spatialized at the time. But I was kind of wondering if, like, moving right up to the point where we kind of get this idea of emotional labor that gets introduced into the economy, and thinking about passing and performing as forms of emotional work that are being done on behalf of the robot. And obviously emotion, as you referenced, not using that word, is an index of humanity, of a knowledge that can't be known by a machine. So I was kind of interested if, in these writings, in the shadow history or more just mundane economic history, you kind of saw discussions about work, because obviously this ideology is coming out of these fears of economic competition.
No, absolutely. So one of it goes back in a way to some of what Simon was raising. One of the crucial premises of the entire set of programs that I've been referring to is automation. And already in the US, for example, effectively one's in a post-Fordist situation from 46, 47 onwards, and Turing is writing about that all the time in the essays and papers that he produces in 47, 48, and 49 up to the 1950 computational intelligence paper, because he's not only describing as what he takes to be the inevitable mechanization, automation of more and more economically significant tasks, but the language he uses to describe those tasks is the language of slavery. So when he's describing in his great briefing document, the 49, he wasn't allowed to do this in public, but we now know, thanks to his biographer, exactly what was going on. He's describing in idealized terms how Bletchley Park worked. He describes what all the women in Bletchley Park did as slave work, and that in principle it could all be automated. And that's when that extraordinary passage about gibberish emerges, because he's predicting correctly that increased automation, as the marginal rate of profit declines, which it does, will be greeted by the managerial class with a kind of political Cartesianism, in which the boss class will increasingly identify itself with unextended mind, and whatever can be automated, this again is a Daston argument, whatever can be automated is therefore subordinate, and it's gendered as such, and it's classed as such, and it's racialized as such. You see that in George Darwin, you absolutely see that in the US at this period. So there's this very interesting passage in Turing where he says that part of what's at stake is, I'm paraphrasing, whether humans could be as familiar with machines as white men are with white men or black men with black. Terrible moment in Turing's writing, right? So you can see some of the issues that are at stake, not just economic, but clearly economic. Right? So I think that's absolutely right. As finally for the issue of the emotive, one text obviously to bring in here is Philip Dick's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which is a much better book than the movie, I think. And that's about using emotion for the Turing test. So exactly what Blade Runner does is to test for humanity machine boundaries around not passing in the Turingian sense, but emotional passing, empathy. Right? And that opens up a very interesting set of debates about emotional literacy and about alienation that we don't have time to talk about.
Or perhaps we can touch upon them over drinks.
Yeah, I can feel the strange attraction.
Well, I would say then, therefore, that we can move outside for drinks right now. So let me finish by thanking Simon and also thanking Daniel for the comments. So we can put our hands together.